Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mysteries and Oddities video. Let's go ahead and let's start off this new series with a brand new suggestion. Please keep those suggestions coming. I'm going to go ahead and do a good handful of them. I've seen already some of the topics that'll stand out over the next couple of weeks. So thank you so much everyone for those entries. This one has to do with a mysterious set of deaths that actually inspired a well-renowned film. This is a film that later on spawned its own franchise, and to this day actually it still has its own following, huge following in fact, especially if you go to a lot of horror cons. But in any case, this set of mysterious deaths actually were true, like they actually occurred, and in turn they ended up inspiring the idea behind this movie. And in fact, you're looking at a representation of it here. Of course, I'm talking about the film The Nightmare on Elm Street, but more specifically for this subject matter, we're going to talk about the mysterious deaths that inspired A Nightmare on Elm Street. Interesting stuff. Like, I never knew this type of history was associated with that film. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. I'd love to hear again what your own thoughts and opinions are on this too. And without further ado, here's essentially what it states. Now, truth be told, I have yet to see the original Nightmare on Elm Street film. I know, shame on me, right? It's one of those films where I've seen snippets of it here and there, and so is the same with some of the other sequels. But I have seen actually the Jason versus Freddy Krueger film, if that helps, at least with that regard. But that entire franchise, the popular franchise, all started with the 1984 film. This was the film that was directed by Wes Craven, and it was done at a very, very low budget. But of course, it caught on very quickly. It became known as a huge slasher film. It was a film that was heralded within the horror entries, and then as such, it made a huge worldwide gross, and then it ended up having one of the largest horror franchises then. But if you knew this then, at least with regards to this bit of info, it would make you look at the film in a whole different way. We all know that in the film, it's basically Freddy Krueger that goes into those dreams/nightmares, and whatever he does to his unwitting victims, usually teens, that's when they in turn get hurt in real life, as opposed to just in the dream itself. Well, according to Wes Craven, he was inspired, like in other words, the film itself, the ideas and the themes associated with Freddy Krueger and what he does were actually inspired by a series of deaths, a real life set of deaths that were occurring here in the United States, especially with some immigrants. And here's in fact his information. I'm actually going to go ahead and quote it from a direct source that he was stating. He said, "I'd read an article in the LA Times about a family who had escaped the killing fields in Cambodia and managed to get to the U.S. Things were fine, and then suddenly the young son was having very disturbing nightmares. He told his parents he was afraid that if he slept, the thing chasing him would get him, so he tried to stay awake for days at a time. When he finally fell asleep, his parents thought the crisis was over. Then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was dead. He died in the middle of a nightmare." As you can see, that's essentially what he was referring to when it came to the basis or the thesis associated with his film. It all has to do with some articles that were there in the Los Angeles Times, which were in turn listed within some of the other articles around LA and then nationwide as well. This occurred in the early 1980s. In fact, you're looking at a picture associated with the article as well. So here's essentially what had happened. These mysterious deaths were afflicting young, healthy Asian men. Particularly, these were men that was known as Hmong. I hope I'm saying that correctly, or the H might exactly be silent. I'm not sure. Somebody let me know on that on the bottom comments. But yes, as it turns out, these refugees were actually people that were coming across over to the U.S. having fled their homeland. This is because they were involved in some battles that were associated there in in that area. And when that happened, they were fighting alongside the U.S. In fact, this was throughout the this was throughout the Vietnam time up until the time that it ended. Once that occurred, that area there, especially Laos, especially Cambodia, areas there in Thailand as well, it turns out that that area then became communist area, and those people that were fighting with the U.S. were suddenly basically enemies, and so they had to flee. They had to flee that location there as quickly as possible. It was almost like moving from point A to point B, just like that, dropping everything they knew about their homeland, everything that they had known in terms of people, in terms of years spent there. All of a sudden, they were here in the U.S. because they had to be here in order to make sure that they were going to survive. And again, these set of deaths exclusively impacted young refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And then what had happened was, and this was again sometime in the 1970s that these mysterious deaths occurred, all of a sudden there was a string of several young men, some in their teens, some in the older ages. When that happened, that's when all of a sudden they had like an idea like not to sleep. Like something was causing them to essentially have nightmares whenever they were sleeping. These were really bad nightmares too. Everyone has nightmares, right? These are the kind that usually you wake up from and everything is okay. You realize that it's just a dream. You go on with your life. But in this case, this was straight out of like a horror film, so to speak, where all of a sudden something was chasing them, and there was this fear that was so strong that they became actually terrified to sleep. And when that happened, they would wake up and then it would be just horrendous stuff, like the type of dreams that whatever was doing, like whatever was essentially causing their nightmares was enough for them to try to stay awake for a long time, several days, in fact, at a time. No one knows, though, exactly what that was, because none of the men essentially were stating that information outright. Like they didn't say, who was it? Who was it that was chasing them? They didn't say any other circumstances about what was the mysterious factor as well. Any descriptions associated with that? No, it was gone. All that was left now was the notion that all of a sudden, and this was around 13, maybe 18 or so such deaths, when these guys were suddenly struck dead in their sleep. And the story was pretty common. It turns out that they would sleep, and in one case, there was a woman who was actually next to her husband. He heard her she heard him actually laboring to breathe. It was so loud, in fact, that it woke her. She saw him, that he was struggling, and right before her eyes, trying to wake him up as quickly as possible. I don't know if it involved slapping him, hitting him, anything along those lines. She could not wake him. All she could do, and this was apparently with tears in her eyes as she was recounting the experience, all she could do was just watch as her husband was getting worse and worse, not waking up from this nightmare, and then he was dead. He was actually dead right there. Whenever it was impacting him within the nightmare itself, it had claimed his life. The only thing we have now, because there's again nothing listed in terms of what was the mysterious factor that was impacting these men, at least in their sleep. I'm saying that like specifically in their sleep. You know how sometimes you can remember dreams, and in most cases you can't, but in some cases you can write them down, you can draw them. No one knows exactly what that was. What was the terrifying images or thing that was chasing these men that they were stating in common unity? No one knows what that was. Instead, the closest that we have is trying to surmise what caused it. So not the nightmare itself, but what caused them to have this fear. One of them has to do with the idea of the forced migration. It's the notion that, again, they had to flee their country. Their country was now under a communist control. They were being seen as traitors. Their family had to leave. These young men were now all of a sudden in a brand new world here in the U.S. And in their turn, I was reading another article that said that unfortunately for a lot of them, even though this was a salvation of sorts, it was a lousy salvation because they were absolutely in a high stressed area. They were in very, very poor situation. They were living in squalors. This was creating extreme stress as well because they were basically outsiders here in the U.S. Who knows what else they were having at the time in terms of other people, especially maybe some people that were picking on them, thinking that they were traitors as well here in the U.S., racism, in other words. That kind of stuff just kept picking at them in total. And gave them an isolated stance because, as an article was stating I was reading, they were completely alien to this world. Everything here was new to them, and now all of a sudden they were dealing with all this stress. And so because of it, that factored in to their dreams. And that kind of stress can indeed cause somebody to have a sudden ailment, like something really, really bad associated with some kind of health. Somebody that would normally be normally healthy, all of a sudden would have something else. This one is a mysterious death, like a sudden death syndrome is another way to put it when it comes to that explanation. Another one is this. It's called Pokuri. Hope I'm saying that correctly. It's apparently an ailment that specifically is documented in Japan. It's almost like a genetic trait of sorts, especially when it comes to younger men. It also ties into the idea of it having to do with sudden death syndrome because the word Pokuri itself is an adverb, meaning suddenly and unexpectedly. Then there's this idea. How about this as well? Again, I was mentioning that they had to flee their country. Well, apparently there's the notion that there's spirits from their country that did not like this. These are spirits that felt that they had to stay in their country to honor their ancestors. And anytime they left their homeland, as they did now, leaving their location, coming to the U.S., meant that their ancestral spirits were going to be mad about that. And so these ancestors are now punishing them in their dreams, and that's what's causing them to have this great fear, and then in some cases leading to actual death as well. That one, again, is a little bit more out there. Like, you would have to believe a multitude of things like outside of science when it comes to trying to figure out why that was happening and how that was occurring to these young men specifically. But at least that's one notion as well. It's the idea that these Hmong minority were being persecuted, not just from their homeland whenever they tried to flee, in other words, by physical people, but also by spirits as well, which is just a whole other world, another fascinating thing associated with this trait. But either way, though, those are some of the theories associated with what happened, like what caused these mysterious deaths, and in turn, it led to the mysterious deaths inspiring A Nightmare on Elm Street. One last bit of trivia, too, associated with that inspiration. Yeah, it turns out that Wes Craven was reading those articles. He was, in turn, realizing that there's a link associated with them, right? It got him curious as to what was causing those deaths as well, including the phenomenon, I forgot to mention this, known as Asian death syndrome, which is another theory that was listed there, too. But then he was also listening to a song called Dream Weaver by Gary Wright, and then that in turn inspired him to link everything together, along with some notions from Eastern religions, to then mix everything in, create a strong focal point in the sense of Freddy Krueger, like he in turn is the actual monster dealing with these deaths physically. And lo and behold, there you have A Nightmare on Elm Street. Crazy stuff. It's sad overall, though, because these young men, whoever they were, whenever they came over, this could have been their chance, right? A chance for the American dream, but in turn, it's turned out to be a literal nightmare for them, and it's something that unfortunately ended up causing their deaths. Very, very tragic altogether. Much mystery associated with that, too. Biggest one, of course, still being, what was the thing that was chasing them, almost like in a uniform manner, in their dreams? But if anybody has any more info, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. What about those of you that maybe were alive during that time, whenever in the 70s, going into the early 80s when this phenomenon was occurring? If anybody has any more info on a local level, maybe somebody that was experiencing this in the LA area, let me know. Please post those comments. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.